Good evening. Welcome to the Computer History Museum. I'm John Holler, the CEO, and I'm so happy to welcome you here tonight on behalf of our board and our staff and our members and our fantastic volunteers. Welcome to another night of Revolutionaries. Let me first say thank you to Intel Corporation tonight. Major funding is provided by Intel. Give it up for Intel. Our steadfast partner for Revolutionaries, and we're so happy. We're delighted to welcome tonight's revolutionary, DARPA Director Dr. Arati Prabhakar. DARPA is, of course, the cutting-edge research and development agency in national defense and military science. DARPA started more than half a century ago as ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, in 1958. And today, DARPA is a $3 billion enterprise with more than 250 programs that are researching and leading breakthroughs in almost every area of defense-related science and technology: materials science, communications technology, high-speed applied computing, aircraft design, global positioning, cyber defense, and much, much more. Because of her training and her vast range of experience, Dr. Prabhakar is uniquely suited to lead DARPA. Her PhD is in applied physics from Caltech. She served under President Clinton as the director of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. In the private sector, she was the Chief Technology Officer at Raychem and President of Interval Research. And for a decade, she was a partner at U.S. Venture Partners, and so she knows her way around investing, startups, and rapidly changing technology. Most importantly, I think, and most impressively, the esteem that she enjoys from all of these circles is incredibly high. Leading the interview for us once again tonight is John Markoff, the senior science writer and 2013 Pulitzer Prize winner from the New York Times. I know it's going to be a fascinating conversation. So with the caveat that we will not have any breaches of national security here tonight, please join me in welcoming Dr. Arati Prabhakar and John Markoff.
You know, I think it's impossible to underestimate the impact that DARPA have had on Silicon Valley. And Arati and I were both going to do this, so I'm going to start with this. I wanted to ask how many of you have had some contact with DARPA, either as a graduate student or a program manager or a researcher?
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's wonderful.
So it looks like it's about 50%, which is sort of what I figured it would be. So I just wanted to go through my own hit list before we get started. I mean, I could spend the entire evening talking about the impact that DARPA's had on the Valley. You know, countless graduate students have had their careers launched by being involved in DARPA. You know, if you went through the Computer History Museum exhibit, it's a little bit like a DARPA filing cabinet, I think. DARPA did not fund the invention of the mouse. Bob Taylor did that when he was at NASA as a project manager, but then he came to ARPA at that point, and he funded Doug Engelbart to do the online system, and that had this huge impact that flowed through the Stanford AI Lab and into Xerox PARC. ARPA funded the Stanford AI Lab. ARPA funded Shaky, the world's first autonomous robot. ARPANET, of course, had a little impact on the world. One thing that I think we've forgotten is the VLSI design methodology that was done by Mead and Conway was ARPA, you know, funded.
And Lynn Conway was actually a program manager at DARPA for a while, right?
That's right. And, you know, so basically the modern semiconductor industry came out of DARPA funding. John Hennessy and David Patterson's work on RISC, which had a huge impact. Jim Clark's geometry engine, which led to SGI and then acquired MIPS. And so, you know, I could keep going, but we'll get to that. I wanted to start by asking you, so how did you come to grow up in Texas?
Well, first, I just want to say how great it is to be back home in Silicon Valley and to see a lot of familiar faces, but also it's always so exciting to see people who've been part of the DARPA community over a long period of time, so this is terrific. How did an Indian kid get to grow up in Lubbock, Texas? Well, not surprisingly, it was because my parents came here from India to go to school. The unusual part of our story was my mom was the one who wanted to come, and she was a social worker. But my dad was the classic story. He was an engineer and got a PhD late in life from Southern Methodist University, got a faculty position at Texas Tech, and there we were in Lubbock, Texas.
didn't TI make things in Lubbock? Wasn't Texas?
They did. He worked for TI in Dallas, but at the time that we moved to Lubbock, I don't think TI had a factory then. He went for a faculty position there. Yeah.
And so your parents were pulled to America. They weren't pushed.
Yeah,
they came
absolutely.
because of opportunity.
Yeah, and they were lucky enough to have the resources to be able to do that. Yeah. And like many others, of course, they came thinking they would be here for a few years and turn around and go back. And, that was 51 years ago.
So in terms of culture, in one of the interviews I read, you said that your mom would start sentences, quote, "when you get your PhD."
That's true. Are there any other Indo-Americans in the audience? I bet I wouldn't be surprised if there are other people in the room who grew up with that. Yeah. But it wasn't a joke. It was just sort of a, but of course.
And so in Indian society, where does that come from? Is there an educated class or? Well,
I think the education is a big priority, I think, in lots of families around the world and in India. But of course, the people who came here in that generation came for an education. My mom was the first woman in her family lineage to go to school outside the home. Her mother was considered overeducated because she had learned to read and write. And so my mom had this tremendous opportunity and went out in the world and went to college and got this education, and then even came to the United States. And I think she always just saw that as that was the purpose of life, was to go learn something and then make the world a better place, and that was imbued in us as kids.
One of my memories of Silicon Valley, when I was at Byte magazine in 1984, I remember going to Sunnyvale and stumbling across an Indian bakery. And what was an Indian bakery doing in the middle of Silicon Valley in California? It was because all these disk drive engineers had come and they had the cultural. So.
Yep, that's right. The food's gotten better with all the immigration that's gone. So it's great.
So my memories of Lubbock is that it was flat.
You've been to Lubbock?
I went there when they were making, I think, more personal computers than any place else in the world.
At Texas Instruments?
The TI-99 was for a while the best-selling, 1981 or something. I don't know where that fits, but did you ever have a TI-99?
I don't think I ever had a TI-99. I remember having TI calculators as in high school. Yeah. And it was so exciting to see that you could, do cosines on a calculator. That was my slice of time.
So you were in high school before personal computers?
Yeah, I was in high school well before personal computers.
Well, it's all gotten kind of vague.
It's all sort of vague out there. So let's see. So when my first job after graduate school, I went to this congressional agency, the Office of Technology Assessment, and that we had a word processor there. So that was 1984.
Yeah. What was your first computer?
What was my first computer?
Personal computer.
Yeah, no, my first work computer, real computer, not just a word processor, was when I was a young program manager at DARPA. And DARPA actually had Macs for a while. And then, then the whole world
moved away.
Went to this other place. I still remember. I mourned when I didn't have my Mac anymore. But since then I've been PC.
So you never went. I mean, you sort of grew up before. You didn't grow up in a hacker culture.
I did not grow up in a hacker culture.
In the good sense of the word.
No, I really did. I mean, let's see. I went into engineering because. Well, partly because it was this sort of cultural expectation, but fortunately for me, I also loved it. And, I went through school at a time when it was very unusual for girls to do science and math and engineering, and, I'm sort of obstinate enough. I'm contrary enough that probably fueled it, right? So people thought that was weird, so I thought, okay, well, let's go do that.
You went from electrical engineering to applied physics, though. Yeah. What kind of trajectory was that?
What that was all about, I went to Caltech for graduate school. Along the way, I had this wonderful fellowship at Bell Labs. That was, Bell Labs was a different thing back in those days. And I had a wonderful mentor there. And he said the most important thing when you go to graduate school is to get a great thesis advisor. He said, you're going to live with this person for all these years. Make sure it's someone that you can really, do work with for an extended period of time. That was pretty good advice to get. I don't think a lot of kids got that in this sort of narrow engineering worldview that we usually were exposed to. So I found a wonderful thesis advisor. He happened to be in applied physics, and so I said, okay, that's what I'm going to go do.
But I got the sense that it wasn't all a walk in the park. As a matter of fact, I think you said your Caltech experience was the worst 5 years of your life.
Yeah, pretty much.
Which is, oh my God, how frank. I mean, was it because it was super hard, or because you were a woman?
It was super hard.
Yeah.
It was super hard. I went to Texas Tech as an undergraduate. I went to school with a bunch of other electrical engineering students, and it prepared all of us to go out and do useful work. And you know, at the end of getting a bachelor's degree, it was not a great preparation for going into this super rigorous, you know, fundamental science-driven, hardcore graduate program at Caltech, which is what I ended up doing. And so I was just in over my head, and you know, probably would have dropped out except for the great thesis advisor. Yeah. But, and I learned that, you know, my mother's expectation that I should get a PhD and then become a tenure-track faculty member, it turned out that really wasn't what my life needed to be about. I didn't get that much joy out of being in the lab at 2 in the morning and having a eureka moment. I got a huge amount of joy out of going to a conference and I remember telling an Intel manufacturing engineer about what my research had shown about transition metal diffusion into silicon, right? And that was satisfying because it actually, I was an engineer at heart. I really wanted to do work that connected and made a difference, and I wanted to go there, so I went a different direction.
And did you cross, because you're in physics, did you cross paths with either Feynman or Mead while you were?
Yeah, so Carver Mead was my grand thesis advisor. Tom McGill was my thesis advisor. Tom had been a student of Carver's, and Carver was on my thesis committee, so I got to know him a little bit then, and then later in my DARPA years, actually, he became a good friend and mentor. We actually just celebrated his 80th birthday a few weeks ago, and that was an amazing reunion of talents that have gone out into the world.
Very neat. And was Feynman still around at that point?
Yeah, he was. I didn't know him, but he was, you know, you'd go to his lectures once in a while. Yeah. It was great. It was a tremendous environment.
And so you were involved in semiconductor physics design?
I was a materials person. I was trying to figure out what was happening deep inside the semiconductor, and for my thesis, I looked at materials and, you know, what was happening with transition metals and silicon. I also looked at indium gallium arsenide phosphide materials to try to understand how laser life was being destroyed by defects. You know, it turned out that none of that worked, so that's why I had to go do the second project. You know, that's how research goes. So.
Did you have access to MOSIS? Was it ARPA funded?
I wasn't doing chip design. I was really living, you know, inside the crystal lattice, essentially. Yeah. So I touched the whole semiconductor world more from the process side. First starting in the material in graduate school, and then in a lot of my DARPA work, it was much more on the process side rather than the design side.
Yeah. So, and yet when I would have expected that it would have been very natural for you to be just sucked into the semiconductor industry. Yeah. Somehow you avoided that fate.
Yeah. No, I remember I interviewed at Intel when I was graduating from Caltech. I just really wanted to try something different. I had been in this head-down, focused research mode, and I didn't go to Washington out of I didn't have a conviction that I wanted to go do policy, or I really just was trying something different because I wanted to get off of the known path. Now, PhD students from Caltech and lots of other places view that degree as a way to go do a whole host of things. Maybe it's research, maybe it's academic, maybe it's, you know, anything else. They go be management consultants, they go into industry. Right. Caltech at that time was much more. I think the view was, of course, you must go do research, and I think a lot of the faculty felt that way. My advisor, fortunately, thought that a PhD should enable you to go do whatever you wanted rather than limiting you. And one day he came in and we didn't know what to do with me. It looked like I might graduate. He was like, well, now what are we going to do with you? So one day he came in and he said, well, you know, why don't you go be a congressional fellow? And we had no idea what it was, but it sounded cool and it was clearly off the beaten track. And so I applied and I got a chance to go, and that was, you know,
was that
off to the races.
OTA at
that was the Office of Technology Assessment, yeah. They had a fellowship program back then, yeah.
Which is now no longer with us.
Yes, that's a loss.
Could we use an OTA in the world today, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, it went away in the mid-90s, and it seemed to me then, and it seems to me now, that technology is probably still pretty important to how our society evolves and moves forward. So I think they did a lot of great work. And other places are carrying some of that forward now, but it's a great place.
So, switching to DARPA, you've had 2 tours. You were a program manager there, or is it project or program manager?
Program manager.
Program manager. Which years were you first there?
I arrived in '86. I was there '86 to '93, starting as a program manager.
And did semiconductor things?
Yeah, absolutely. I went to go work on digital gallium arsenide. Can you imagine?
Did it? At that point, was gallium arsenide still considered a candidate to be the future of semiconductors?
Well, I think the people who were working on it thought maybe it was going to be the future of semiconductors. At that time, there was a lot of interest in it at DARPA because of its radiation-hard properties. And so let's see, this is 1986. Now, of course, the silicon juggernaut seems completely inevitable, but at that time people were still talking about, electron mobility is higher in gallium arsenide, which is true, just not all that relevant if you want to build a big complex circuit. But we learned a tremendous amount about the technology. We built a lot of the foundation that became very relevant for where gallium arsenide did, of course, blossom, which was RF devices and the whole MMIC and microwave world. But I don't know. Now I look back at my program managers all think I must have done something staggeringly amazing at DARPA, and I got to do some good things later, but I certainly did not have a huge success with the first thing I came in to help.
Wasn't that
drive.
the era? Didn't Seymour Cray build supercomputers out of gallium?
Yeah, that was all going on then.
And was DARPA part of that, or was he doing it on?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that we interacted a lot with them. I don't remember whether we were funding them directly. Our work, my office at that time was funding early pilot lines at places like Rockwell and McDonnell Douglas and Bell Labs to try to build. Let's see, the first big thing was, could you build a 16K memory out of gallium arsenide? Isn't that sweet now? It's sort of sweet to think about that. We did, we did.
And this is not what direction I want to go, but sort of what's DARPA doing these days in semiconductors? Is there?
Yeah, it's a very different world. So in my time at DARPA, I started a new office. It was the Microelectronics Technology Office. Because we had gotten enough electronics stuff going. At that time, we were doing really sort of wrapping up the digital gallium arsenide work, but we had Semitech, we were making these investments in advanced lithography, did a lot of the early 193 nanometer work, to turn that into a real lithography technology, a whole host of other things. But it was really interesting to come back 19 years later, and we have an office that's MTO. It's now the Microsystems Technology Office. It has some roots that trace all the way back to the office I started. But the world is so different, of course, because Moore's Law has marched along at this phenomenal pace, but is running out now. I mean, we're living the end of Moore's Law in various ways. It's not news to anyone in the industry, but it's still sort of seeping in to the rest of the world. The industry was global before. It is now completely, aggressively, wholly globalized. That's very different. Now, in the lithography world, just as an example, I think TSMC now drove the last change in lithography technology, moving to immersion 193, right? I mean, when I was at DARPA 20 years ago, it was inconceivable that a non-American company would drive that. But of course, as the technology globalizes and manufacturing globalizes, the process is going to get driven from other places. So it's a very different landscape. The thing that is happening now in microelectronics that is incredibly valuable for the Defense Department is, if you look particularly at one of the areas we care a lot about is what can you build in terms of advanced radar systems, just as one example. So we were doing work in gallium arsenide in the old days. After the digital period, there was a big MMIC program in the Defense Department. DARPA was involved with that. That laid the foundations for these massive, very sophisticated electronic arrays that are on our aircraft and on our ships today. That came directly out of that technology.
What would an advanced radar do that today's radars don't?
The current generation of radars that we use, of course, these are these big apertures made up of these gallium arsenide arrays. That's the technology that's out there today, and that's what a fighter uses to look out for this vast distance to see what's out ahead of it. It's also the system that's used for communications. It's the same system that's used to jam jam the other side. So it's, you know, integral part of shaping the electromagnetic spectrum in warfighting. The core technology today is gallium arsenide based, tracing back to some of those early investments. But then today, the research that's going on is the next generation's gallium nitride technology, something that was just barely beginning in research when I left 20 years ago. Now it has come into full fruition, and the next generation of major military radars are going to be based on this next generation of technology.
Could you conceive of consumer applications? Cars now have radars.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a very long history here, as in many other areas, where we made these investments for these defense purposes, and often those military systems, because of their aggressive needs, became the first applications, but then those technologies spilled over. So the, you know, the gallium arsenide power amp that is in your cell phone, that is what talks to the cell phone tower, traces back to the, you know, it went off on a different commercial path, but it has its roots back in that same core research that happened many decades ago. And I think similarly, the things that today are the bleeding edge of high-end military capability, some of those technologies too will be in cell phone towers, and they'll be used in the world around us.
One of the general questions I want to ask, so 2 tours at DARPA.
Yeah.
How had the agency changed?
Oh, that was the biggest question I had going back a couple of years ago, because I was thrilled to get the chance to go back, but I hadn't really had much interaction with the agency. Been off doing other non-defense related things for nearly 2 decades. And so that was the biggest question in my mind going back. And, you know, DARPA had just moved into a brand new building a few weeks before I showed up, so it felt different. And technology had changed in dramatic ways in the when I left DARPA in 1993, I didn't have a cell phone, right? And we still had to force our contractors to get email addresses. They were like, why do you want to do email? We don't get this thing. You know, it's hard to even imagine that. Yeah. So the technology had changed. Geopolitics has changed dramatically. We're coming through this period of 2 extended ground wars and a focus on counterterrorism. When I left DARPA, we were just figuring out what it meant that the Cold War had ended. What was the world going to be like? It turned out it was a very, you know, in a lot of ways, a very confusing and complex world. So everything is different. But about 2 days after I got there, I realized that program managers are still just like running in the door in the morning with their hair on fire, because they have something that they have got to do that's going to change the world. And I was so happy when I realized that the culture was still sound. And your customer, the Pentagon, have they changed? I mean, the relationship that DARPA has with, is that changed in a significant way? You know, in a fundamental way, I think that relationship has not changed. Every one of my predecessors I talked to or that I read about dealt with some of the same issues. You know, here's an agency created after Sputnik, specifically created to prevent that kind of technological surprise. Very quickly realized that the way you prevent surprises, you create your own surprises. But, you know, we exist not to do those incremental things that are very necessary. We exist specifically to do the technologies that allow for big steps forward in capability. Well, inherent in that is that most of our most powerful new technologies disrupt the way that the military works. And so, you know, we have lots of people in the Pentagon who, when they see us coming, go, oh, here comes DARPA again. And fortunately, over many, many decades, we've built, I think, a very compelling track record. And so people with a little bit more vision will give us the time of day and we can start working. But it's not always easy to, you know, shift to stealth technology or to move to precision guided weapons or infrared night vision. I mean, those are not, you know, those are always hard challenges. So that remains true for the next generation of things we're working on. One thing that DARPA didn't do when you were there the first time around that they do now is they have these challenges. Yeah. Started with the autonomous vehicle. I think that was the first one. Yeah, and now you have a whole portfolio of challenges. I wanted to ask first about the rescue challenge. So DARPA is in the midst of this robot contest. That's right. And have you had a chance to step back? I mean, so the autonomous vehicle had a challenge. It turned out to have this huge impact on the world that probably nobody would have guessed, in a way, that it just set the automobile industry on fire. Google took a lot of your technology. What might the robot challenge do? I mean, it was targeted, wasn't it, at Fukushima-like situations, but what are the second order effects that might come out of something like that? I think that's great, because first of all, a challenge is a great way to add to our portfolio of ways that we can interact and build the technical community. And I think, you know, it doesn't work for all situations, but it's particularly valuable when you've got lots of bits and pieces of the component technologies, and you really just want to see what people can do today and just create an environment where they can head-on compete with each other and try to accomplish something that seems, at the beginning, it seems very, very, very hard. And of course, the first DARPA challenge, had no winners, and then very rapidly afterwards, we saw this huge step forward and the progress that was made because, I think that's the capability that it evokes. So similarly, I think with the DARPA Robotics Challenge, we had our trials last December. The finals will be in about another year. And at the trials, it was structured around disaster relief and humanitarian aid. So robots that were competing had to be able to cut a hole in a wall. They had to be able to climb a ladder. They had to be able to drive a vehicle, all based on the kinds of things that would have been wonderful to have had in a Fukushima kind of situation. So, it was amazingly funny, actually, I thought, to watch the robots in December, because scintillating moments of watching a robot walk up to a ladder and then spend 6 minutes looking at the ladder, right? and so, you realize where we are, and then every time a robot, after watching it would take a step or two, and then the whole crowd would say, ooh, and it was amazing to see what they could do, but also very sobering to realize how limited the capability is today. I'm really sure we're going to see a huge amount of progress by the time of the finals.
One of the things about the first context is almost everything was teleoperated.
Yes,
and we almost saw no autonomy.
Very little autonomy.
You guys wanted to foster autonomy, and it hasn't really showed up yet.
Well, I think it just shows you where we are. Ground robotics is just an incredibly difficult challenge. The things you can do autonomously in the air or in space or even in the open ocean, I think are going to be much easier. The ground environment is the most challenging. So that particular trial, they were all teleoperated. The bandwidth of that communications was being squeezed on and off to simulate an environment where you couldn't count on communications. But the reason it took so long for robots to actually do anything was, the operators were waiting and waiting and waiting to get enough of a picture from from the robot itself of what was going on so that they could plan and then transmit instructions. Now, I think that's also going to get a lot better by the next time.
That point about the ground challenge is a really interesting one, because I think what led to the first grand challenge is that Congress, I can't remember the year, but they mandated that a third of the nation's military land fleet be autonomous by 2015, which I don't think we're
making it.
So all this good stuff came out of it, but it didn't actually meet its kind of an interesting.
Yeah. Well, you can't. You can have those aspirations, but as you know, those are not milestones you can just drive to, if you'll forgive the expression.
There's also been this fantastically interesting subtext to me. DARPA put hundreds of millions of dollars into a company called Boston Dynamics, which arguably is one of the best robotics companies in the world, and along comes Google last year and they buy it. Are you okay with that?
I'm actually personally not only okay with it, but I think it's a very promising sign. There's a long history of DARPA making investments in technologies to show what's possible. And then when those technologies have commercial futures, private capital and private companies and entrepreneurs they take the baton and they run that next stage with it. Of course, we also work on a lot of things that are directly and only for the military, and so the next stage looks different in that case. But so much of what we talked about here in Silicon Valley was exactly this: the spark at the beginning, and then really this much vaster set of investments and a much larger community that gets involved to start turning those technologies into products and companies and then industries. So, time will tell, but robotics is, I think, very much in that category, a technology where we want to show it's possible, but it's going to take a massive private investment and real markets to turn it into something that, that has enough capability that can be purchased for a low enough price that ultimately I think it really will become something that helps the military tremendously. But I don't want to go it all alone anyway, so I'm hoping Google and others will go do great things with the technology.
The other really wonderfully ironic thing that happened there was that the best of the competitors so far is this company called Shaft.
Yeah.
And Shaft also was bought by Google, and you know, the reason that SHAFT existed is because Japanese universities can't participate in DARPA-like events, and so these kids had to leave the university and they had to become...
Isn't that a great story?
And then along comes, and you know, there's a tremendous hand-wringing in Japan right now because basically Google picked off the best robotics technology, and I mean, I guess it's not a DARPA issue, but it's an interesting second-order effect from the contest.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I try to talk a lot about with people in the Pentagon is trying to really show them how incredibly global technology is today. And I think this is a great example because here's a Japanese company formed out of Japanese university to participate in a Defense Department contest in the United States, and then, you know, it's acquired by Google. That this is what technology is today, right? And so now, where's the American part of that? You don't get to actually draw those boundaries anymore.
Well, and how does that play with the surprise issue? I mean, if you're, I mean, I keep looking for one of those kinds of international surprises yet, and we really haven't seen anything yet. But as the technology falls in cost, isn't it more likely that there's going to be some sort of surprise?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the landscape is just very, very different. One of the assumptions that we had for decades was, in the national security context, the assumption was that the technologies that we developed in this country would be harvested for national security purposes first here. And you know, we always understood that over time these technologies would become global. But you know, over and over again there would be American innovation that led to American companies serving American markets, and that could be something that lasted for years, decades in many cases, right? If you think about industry after industry. And then it globalized. And in a sense, I think we as a nation, for national security purposes, but more broadly in our economy, I think we had time to think about it and then adjust and then globalize. And of course, that's not how the next generation of technologies is developing. You see, I think we still have tremendous research strengths here, so still often many things germinate here. That's going to start changing as well as the rest of the world, you know, grows its research capacity. But the things that germinate here, you know, production can be global from the get-go. Small companies that we worked with in the venture world, when I had the privilege of doing that work, you know, the two founders of a company, but when they're thinking about markets, they're thinking about global markets from the very beginning. So that has huge implications from a national security perspective.
In your testimony recently, you've talked about these ecologies, these research ecologies, and when you talked about the ecology, it made me wonder how fragile they are.
Yeah,
and,
right. Yeah, I worry about that a lot.
And so then what's DARPA's responsibility? I mean, I know that DARPA directors have gotten in trouble for flirting with industrial policy, and yet the reality is it's de facto industrial policy, isn't it, whether we call it that or not? And
there's actually an Office of Industrial Policy in the Defense Department. Because they're actually supposed to worry about, in that case, the defense industrial base. But you know, that's a government-owned mission that we rely on the public sector to deliver, and I think that has traditionally been the driver behind a lot of the investments in technology. But what is DARPA's role? I think that's really your question. So first of all, for context, DARPA's budget is, what are we, about 2%, 2 or 3% of federal investment in R&D. And we're even less than that if you think about the whole country, right?
And
so we just have this small piece, that's all.
So in R&D, I'm always wondering what's R and what's D.
Yeah.
Of your 2%, how much is real R in the sense of...
Well, I don't know, you can have your own definitions of what it is. We don't do product development. The closest thing we do would be to build a military prototype of a system. We have a program called the Long Range Anti-Ship Missile, for example, where last year we had successful flight tests. So that's a prototype stage. That's within our portfolio. It was probably the most mature technology we worked on. The Navy's now driving it forward, but that's on one end of the spectrum. The other end of our spectrum is much more basic research, where we're trying to really discover if there are new insights about a new research area that'll open up technology opportunities for the future. So that's the world that we live in. Other parts of the federal R&D investment, of course, include the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. All of that is very research-oriented. part of it is weapon systems a lot of it is actually weapon systems development and DoD. That's much more like, that's more D, right? I mean, that's really building a product. So it's a mix, but as you know, a lot of the R that gets done in the country is still from federal sources.
Like, is there any, you were talking about sort of seeing the end of Moore's Law, and is that on your horizon as a DARPA director trying to push that out? Are you spending dollars?
Doing something about that isn't directly in our sights. First and foremost, because there's a $300 billion global industry that lives and dies by figuring out what to do about that. And number one. And then number two, I think that in that particular technology area, the next advances are going to be immediately globally commoditized. I don't really see an opportunity for us to get a national security advantage or edge. So there, I'm much more interested in the question of how do we become the best and fastest user of this global, continuing VLSI revolution. And then I think there's some very interesting questions about how will we continue to keep up with this flood of data and manage it in real time when you can't count on just Moore's Law giving you more and more gates forever. To do that with. And that opens all kinds of interesting questions about new architectures and new ways that you might want to start thinking about special purpose processors that for the classes of problems that we deal with. And that's a live conversation today, is to try to figure out if there are places we should be thinking about there.
One of your areas is the brain.
Yeah.
And one of the new areas.
That's very exciting.
Also biology. But let's start with the brain. And I think, did you bring some multimedia aids?
If we could just bring up the first picture. So this is work that we've been doing. Biology and how it is becoming, it's intersecting now with physical science and technology, with information technology. Biology is at a time where we think it has enormous potential to become not just research, not just medical applications, but really the foundation for whole new powerful technologies. And our interest is turning biology into technology. So one of the areas that we're investing is in neurotechnologies. The work I wanted to share with folks is work that we've been doing on brain function research that starts with about 10 years ago. One of our program managers at that time was Colonel Jeff Ling. He was a colonel in the Army, a neurointensivist by training. He had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. He came back from theater convinced that we had to find a better way to give prosthetics to our wounded warriors who had lost upper limbs. Because the standard of care still is just a simple hook, something we've had for many, many decades. Jeff started off to build a program that had a couple of branches. One was simply to make a much more sophisticated mechanical arm with many more degrees of freedom. And in fact, one of the very early versions of that just got FDA approval, which is tremendous. I think it might actually become the first thing beyond the hook that people can use and really start changing their lives. But because Jeff also is a neuroscientist, the second part of what he wanted to understand was how motor control in the brain actually controls the way our limbs move. And so a second branch of the research was doing the work to understand the neural signaling that leads to motor control. Those two branches of research came together over the last few years as we just started the first few experiments working with human volunteers. And the first few folks have been quadriplegics who volunteered to have chips implanted to pick up their motor cortex signals from the neural firing that's going on, and to try to use that to control some of these new arms. And the series of things I wanted to share with folks, really I'd like to show you how that field is moving. In 2002, when Jeff started this work, very wise people in the field said it's going to be 50 years before you can directly neurally control a prosthetic arm. And let me show you what's actually happening. So in this first video that you'll see in a moment, you see Tim sitting in the chair with the ball cap on. Tim was injured in a motorcycle accident, and he doesn't have the use of his limbs. He volunteered to be the very first human trial to get this implant. Very simple implant was placed on his motor cortex, and sitting with him in the background is one of the researchers at the University of Pittsburgh where the work was doing. And this young woman in the front, you can see her lovely tattoo, that's his fiancée, that's Katie. And the first thing you'll see in this video is very soon after recovery, what Tim is able to do with the prosthetic arm. And then you'll see Katie get into the action. So why don't you go ahead and play that video. So he's just practicing touching different parts on that board.
Baby, I want to hold your hand. You don't have to keep doing it if you don't want to. We're ready whenever you're ready. Okay.
Yeah, I was just having a moment there. Okay, I'm done. Tell you what, she's talking.
I find the two of them very moving. That was about 20 minutes after he started trying to think and move the arm. So they would sort of train him by moving the arm and having him think in a way that corresponded to where the arm had moved. And that was really the first time he was just thinking and moving the arm. So amazing that we were able to do that. A year later, we were able to get our second human trial. And if you bring up the next image, this is a woman named Jan. She read or heard in the local press in Pittsburgh, where she lives, that the University of Pittsburgh was looking for volunteers. Jan had been a quadriplegic by that point for a number of years. Decided to volunteer for this surgery. She had a little bit more sophisticated array placed, and Tim was only able to have his array for a very short period of time, so we weren't able to get very far. Jan was actually able to have the array for an extended period of time, and first we'll show you what she could do after a few months. Go ahead and roll this one.
5 months after the surgery, we came back to see whether she would be able to control the robotic arm with nothing but her thoughts. They plugged her brain into the computer, and this is what we saw.
I can move it up and straight down and left and right and diagonally. I can close it and open it, and I can go forward and back.
That is just the most astounding thing I've ever seen. Can we shake hands?
Sure.
No, really?
Yeah.
Like, come right over here?
Yes, you come over there.
Okay.
You grasp your hand there. There we go.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And I can do a fist bump if you'd like.
That's amazing. What are you doing, Jan? What's going on in your mind as you're moving this arm around? What are you thinking?
Okay, the best way to explain it is raise your arm.
Uh-huh.
Go. Now,
Right.
What did you think about when you did that?
Well, not very much. I do it all the time.
Exactly. It's automatic.
Is that hard work? Are you having to concentrate?
No, it was hard work getting there. I struggled greatly to go up and down at the beginning. Now up and down is so easy, I don't even think about it. Side to side, don't even think about it.
Just like
that.
Your arms used to.
Yes.
And she is really amazing. That was the moment my moment of wow when I first saw this was realizing that it was not, she's not thinking about moving her right forefinger and then, twisting her wrist. It's that natural kind of control. And, you know, as Jeff Ling talks about this, Jeff will tell you, and I think he's really right, that we've opened a door, and we haven't stepped through it. We don't know what's on the other side quite yet, but it's a door that allows us to imagine freeing the brain from the body. And the power of what it can do to restore function, I think, is very obvious. But beyond that, of course, think about you know, remember how we've been revolutionizing the human-machine interface?
Yeah. So programmatically,
who knows where this could go?
So, what are you doing sort of next steps? I mean, you've taken it here.
So I'll show you one next step, but I think that, you know, so we're at a very interesting juncture because we pursue these technologies because of their power and their potential, but at the same time, you can easily, you know, you can take a trip to the moon and imagine wonderful things. You can take a trip to a dark place and imagine some terrible things as well. So I think it's a good time to stop and think about where we are, what might be possible, and what might be the right next thing to do. But I want to show you one last clip. So that was about a year ago. Jen has been tolerating the implant very well. She's been doing amazing things. We got FDA approval to extend her time to continue to wear the implant. And then people said, well, gee, you know, she's really great with this one arm. What would happen if we gave her two arms? Now, you know, the very first thing you read in a neuroscience textbook is that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So go ahead and play the next clip, and you can see what Jan's now able to do. You've got the two arms.
Nice.
Same connections.
Very nice.
To the same chip implant.
Interesting. She's controlling both of them from the same?
Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful. Really nice. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so just when you think you might know what the brain is doing, it's, you know, it's so amazing as an organ and so plastic and so capable. Yeah. So you know, this is a great example of something that I know is going to be powerful in over probably 20 to 50 years, and the first few steps will be restoration of function, but I think out beyond that you can start seeing a lot of other things that are going to be possible.
You've just created, separate from brain, although maybe it's within it, you've created this biological or biology technology office. So I heard your program manager speak at MIT at a synthetic biology conference. Yeah. What was striking to me about the conference is both the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI were there, and the FBI spoke. Yeah. To your point about the possibility of going in dark directions. Yeah. But so, why did you create a biology technology office? Now you want to create these things as technology. What are you doing specifically with that, separate from brain?
DARPA's been investing in biology-related technologies for 20 years. It's, you know, starting with biological defense technology, some of which are now out in the world and helping provide protection. But when I got to DARPA, I thought it was a very fertile area. I saw a number of programs that we were doing, the neuroscience. This is only one of about 3 or 4 amazing things that are happening in neuroscience and neurotechnologies. In addition to that, we're doing the synthetic biology work that you referenced. You know, scientists have known for so long now that if you can engineer microorganisms in cultured cells, they can start producing all kinds of interesting chemistries and materials. We see enormous potential in that, but we want to turn it into a scalable engineering discipline where, you know, instead of costing many tens of millions of dollars and taking years and years to do one development of a new material or chemistry, can we really turn that into a scalable engineering practice? Well,
so draw the analogy. So you were in school roughly around the time that Mead and Conway created this VLSI design technology. When I was at that synthetic biology conference, it occurred to me, maybe, are they roughly the same place? Are they 10 years off?
They might be. They might be. I mean, certainly we see the potential for a kind of scale in the ability to manipulate and manage these microorganisms. Of course, what's already happening, this isn't a DARPA story, but our ability to sequence and synthesize DNA is on these very aggressive cost curves. That's always an exciting sign when you see, you know, technology being able to do those things. And that's an ingredient in the synthetic biology world. I think, you know, I am inspired by what we have seen in lots of other engineering disciplines and the potential to unleash those kinds of trends in biology. I am also chastened when I think about how little we understand about biological evolved complexity as opposed to the kind of complexity that we designed as engineers in the information world, in the microelectronics world. So it's an aspiration, but I think we're going to go about it in some different ways because of biology's relative strengths, and it's phenomenally capable at reproducing and surviving and adapting. On the other hand, it feels intractable compared to transistors or lines of code, right? So anyway, so brain work, synthetic biology, work to fight infectious disease. Can we outpace the spread of infectious disease? Those are examples of biology-related things that we were doing already at DARPA. We scooped them together into this new office in order to give the area more focus and to start engaging that community in a more focused fashion. I think it's going to be a good experiment.
So in the 1970s, the molecular biology community came together and they met at Asilomar to try to assess. Right. They stopped research for a while. One of the things that I took away from hearing George Church talk, particularly at MIT, is there's a new editing technique called CRISPR that is tremendously powerful. But I just wonder if we're not at this sort of cusp where maybe we should pause and think a little bit again.
Yeah, no, and very much to your point about organizations like the FBI showing up at a synthetic biology meeting. This is the classic. These are the classic two edges of the sword, because the power of the technology is so tantalizing, and yet we know, that bad actors are going to be able to have access to these technologies. And if there are amazing new materials and structures and sensors that we can build out of synthetic biology, equally we know there are going to be some horrific things that can be built out of synthetic biology. So let me just back up and say a minute about how we think about this at DARPA. Because we are a technology agency, and how we navigate those kinds of issues is something we've been talking very explicitly about in the agency. It's an age-old problem, because our job is to be at that leading edge of technology. So I think it's natural we stumble into these situations frequently. Today they come up when we think about where brain research is going to take us, where synthetic biology will take us. Every time we start thinking about big data opportunities for national security, we run plop into privacy issues. So it's endemic in some sense. We have two jobs at DARPA when those situations arise. The first is to remember that our core mission is to pursue these advanced technologies for our nation. And I want to make sure that we never shy away from looking at a powerful new technology simply because we're concerned about how it will be perceived. I don't want to hear my program manager say, well, I don't really want to think about that because what if it showed up in the Washington Post? Because we actually have to be able to take that head on. It's number one. But number two, that goes hand in hand with that, I think it's also our obligation, since we often stumble into these questions early, it's our obligation to engage those issues, to raise them, to get them into the public eye, to engage the conversation with a much broader community that's going to be part of answering the questions about how society uses those technologies. I don't want to live in a society where a bunch of technologists and national security tell you how you're going to use those things. That's not really where I want to go. But we have done that as an example. We have a panel of experts in synthetic biology, a different group for the neuroscience work, and we use it as a two-way mechanism. We show them what's going to be possible. We engage them so that they can help us think and help our research community think about the ways to manage and pursue research in the directions that will be the most positive.
We talked about this in the biology context. I just picked up Charles Hertzfeld's autobiography, and the one funny aside there is that he said, well, we created this thing called the ARPANET, and we, unfortunately, he said, put off security for later.
Later is here, huh?
So later is here. You've got a challenge in the cyberspace.
Yeah.
I mean, you're sort of working actually both sides of the street. I mean, you've got Plan X, which is an offensive technology, and then you're also looking, I guess, at a number of levels at the security issue. The most interesting thing, stuff that I think you're doing is down in the hardware, because I don't know if if you can't trust the hardware, whatever you do in software doesn't seem like it'll have an impact.
You probably have a good debate about that with this crowd here. So what are you thinking about when you say the hardware? That we have a program on.
Let's see, is it called Crash? A program called Crash to start over from the, start rethinking it from the ground floor, because there's logic in hardware too, and if it's being made in Asia, how can you trust it? I think that's sort of
wherever it's being made. It's being made everywhere, right? So,
so where are you going? I mean, is there a cyber point that's sort of top of the list?
Yeah, so we have a very substantial cybersecurity portfolio. Like everything else, our job is not the operational today issues of cybersecurity. What we observe is people who have that issue in national security or anywhere else are scrambling. Patch and pray is what we have, and patching and praying faster is sort of really all that people are able to do. So that I don't want to denigrate it. It's really, you have to do that. What we want to do is figure out the technologies that give us a future where there's some foundation of cybersecurity. These are statistical threats, and so I'm not talking about invulnerability. I am talking about, if you like, the equivalent of physical security, where you can live in a safe neighborhood and you have locks on your doors and security cameras and a police force. And the things that allow you to get on with the rest of your life and have a foundation of security. So what are those things? It's not, there's so many attack vectors because of the vastness of our information environment. So it's not going to be a silver bullet. It's going to be a layered set of many, many different technologies. One example is work that we're doing to see if we can scale formal methods to start building meaningful sized OSs that can be provably correct for specified security properties. We just flew a drone in the courtyard of the Pentagon a couple of weeks ago that has the first OS that has at least some properties that are unhackable now. So that it's sort of the bare beginnings of something that's a big dream. But it's going to be that and dozens of other technologies that seep out and start building that foundation.
This is very frustrating because I have about 250 or so DARPA programs.
Yeah, lots of programs.
There are about 20 I want to ask you about. I'm going to ask you about one, and then I'm going to go to the...
I'll be short so you can get through lots of them.
So the future of GPS, you have this technology called cold atom that I just started to read about that sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Could you...
Yeah, so first of all, GPS was this wonderful miracle. I mean, we're all addicted to it. The military is addicted to it. But because it's been such a powerful, cheap way, once you put the satellites up, it's so cheap and easy to have that receiver and know what your position is and get accurate time. As a consequence, we've forgotten how we used to do PNT, position, navigation, and timing, which was layers, right? You'd have internal gyros and inertial navigation systems. You'd have external fixes, and you would layer all of these things together and integrate them and then figure out what your position and time is. So we're going to have to go back to that with these huge advances in the underlying technologies, one of which is in timing, and in navigation as well. We're finding ways to harness this utterly beautiful physics from a couple of decades ago. A couple of decades ago, cold atom physics was starting to do the research that led to Nobel Prizes. And so beautiful to think about cooling atoms by shining lasers at them, right? So they achieve these states where they're in this sort of pure magical environment where you can start using them and tapping their atomic properties. So it was gorgeous science, but the people who lived in the world of position, navigation, and timing have also seen the seeds in that research, the seeds of huge advances in clocks and in navigation systems. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing the last few years is how do you get these technologies from a huge room with optical benches and lots of sophisticated PhDs to tend it, how do you start getting it down to a box, a shoebox that could be on a ship or on a submarine so that they would lose, a nanosecond over a year or something. So.
And give them an independent location ability that's incredibly precise.
Yeah, the ability to not drift in your time and your position keeping capability.
This would be totally separate from GPS. It would be like an inertial system. Or
but again, really, if you want to be able to navigate and tell time, you need a fix to lock to, and then what you want is the lowest amount of drift for the longest amount of time, be it time drift or positional drift, right? So you're going to need both. You're going to need the external fixes. You'll need new external fixes if you don't want to rely on GPS, and you're going to need these much more, low drift technologies.
So let me ask some of the audience questions before we entirely run out of time. what was it like to being a female PhD student at Caltech?
There weren't a lot of us in the old days. There are a few more now. You know, Caltech is a place that is full of, I hope I'm not going to offend anyone if I say it's full of nerds, but it's full of nerds. It was, and as far as I can tell, it still is. I was one, I still am one. But what I found was, in my time, it was not, people weren't overtly hostile. It was just sort of like, they didn't really know what you were doing there. They were like a little confused about it. So, I don't know, it was a little, it wasn't a warm, welcoming environment, but it wasn't, you know, it wasn't hostile either. It was just sort of like everyone was doing their research, and here you were. So.
Here's another related one, which I'll ask as well. What challenges have you faced as a woman in your career? Has being an Indo-American woman affected how you have been received in any way?
You know, because I grew up in Lubbock, Texas in the 70s, went to high school in the 70s in Lubbock.
You're more American than I am.
Well, no, but I mean, I went to a high school, now there's this huge Indian community, but when I went to high school in Lubbock, Texas, I was the only Indian kid in my high school. And it gave me the ability to feel completely comfortable when I'm in a room where no one else looks like me, and I'm usually in a room like that, and it doesn't really bother me. So I think I was so lucky to have had that experience. So I usually find that you know, there's some situations, this is less and less true, but early in my career there were situations where it was notable, or people would note and make a comment about, you know, the fact that I was a woman. But pretty soon you would all get to work on something, and then you were working together, and that's, you know, that's how it becomes something that is just part of the environment. And I think it's a good journey. We're still on it.
Yeah. So you partially answered this one, but I'll ask again in case there's anything else. Is DARPA involved with any technologies from the quantum world? If so, can you describe the technology and involvement beyond cold atom?
Yeah, no, I mean, we talked about the cold atom work, which I think is one area. I mean, quantum science is really so beautiful and so interesting right now. One of our program managers, Matt Goodman, who just left just last week, was doing a whole series of very beautiful work. One of the interesting things he was finding was a quantum component or element in the way we smell, right? In our sense of smell. So who knew, right? But I don't even understand that work, but Matt would tell me about quantum mechanics and what was going on. So I think there are all kinds of different, you know, there are whole hosts of applications. It's moving from beautiful science to some powerful and practical things, which is great.
Are you spending money on quantum computing?
Quantum computing is not an active area.
Yeah. Okay. Quantum communication?
I don't know if we have anything in quantum communications.
Here's a question. What is the future for the advanced circuit development on Flex? Is there something called Flex? I don't know. I don't know. Okay.
Flexible circuits? I don't know. I mean, one of the interesting things in that arena is work on disappearing electronics. There was some beautiful research with people making silk materials, you know, artificial silks essentially, and then being able to make these incredibly thin, light, but functional circuits on it. So disappearing, you know, electronics that could be functional, but then programmed to self-destruct or to, you know, dissolve in water. And I think there'll be interesting applications from that.
Are there sort of next generation drone technologies that are, DARPA was very involved in the origin.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about it, but you know, one of the major areas of focus today for us is this issue of completely breaking the complexity of military systems. Our massive platforms, our fighters, our spacecraft are these incredibly very, very powerful, capable systems, but they are ungodly expensive, incredibly inflexible because of these complex subsystems that are all tightly coupled, you know, to build the next generation fighter, for example. We are looking for ways to continue to have much more powerful capability in the air domain, in space, in what you know, a soldier carries on his body, but finding ways to do it that allows for scale and an open architecture so that you can start you know, getting the benefit of all that complexity without just being killed by it. Now, as you start doing that, you know, really what we're talking about is using microelectronics and microsystems and algorithms and information technology, but instead of cramming it all onto a massive platform, there are now some pretty amazing things you can start doing by distributing capability and having combined coherent effects, for example, for jamming or shaping the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, when you do all of that, it might open the door to some very interesting new platform architectures where you have a lot of small drones or unmanned systems that are able to cooperate and achieve very interesting mission effects.
It's not really the same. Do you remember in robotics, Rod Brooks led a sort of anti-big system approach called fast, cheap, and out of control? Does it share anything?
Yeah, I don't know that in detail, but I think it shares some of the same elements of thinking. Right, instead of thinking monolithic, you think about lots of small units, but figuring out ways that they can be very, very capable together.
You guys have, here's a question I think you have some programs that deal with. Software is very hard to build, especially when creating large-scale systems that might operate military systems. Yeah. What is DARPA doing to improve the software development process?
Yeah, well, this comes right into...
Is Muse an example?
Muse is a great example. But so number one, I think back to this issue of our tightly coupled subsystems, the software complexity gets just completely out of control, and that's one of our big issues in cost and inflexibility. Muse is a new program that says, well, you know, there are, I don't know, hundreds of billions of lines of code in the open world, right? So that could be quite a resource if you knew how to find the pieces that are out there that have been proven, that are tested, that work, and then find the right pieces of code for whatever it is you're trying to do, and then start automating the assembly of code to do higher level functions. So there's a wonderful display here at the museum that looks at the history of programming languages, and I'd love to see that end up in a future where you know, everyone can program, but it doesn't have to be about languages, because you're just able to use machines to do all of that work that is, you know, employing everyone in Silicon Valley today.
Another subject. So we're running late. This is perhaps a good question to end on. George McGovern proposed that part of the U.S. public education system should be funded by the Department of Defense. We need more brains than brawn, particularly as the world gets more technical. Your stance on this?
It's hard to disagree about more brains than brawn. We showed you some of the brain work, but is the question specifically about education?
I think it's just, yeah, the role of defense and education.
I think it's had such an important role, especially since Sputnik. I think many of us have grown up in that period and benefited from it in ways that were visible or not visible to us. But you know, it really comes back. Let me just step all the way back. If you look at what is driving research and development and technology in this country, there was a time not long ago when about half of that funding was coming from the federal government and about half from the private sector. Today it's about 2/3 private and 1/3 government, because in fact private investment in R&D is growing faster than GDP. You can see the intensification of the innovation economy in those numbers. And I think that the role of government in all of this is shifting before our eyes. Many of us grew up in a time when that was the predominant source of research. It was the core driver of a lot of these technologies. And I think what has come from that is these incredibly powerful, innovative industries. But I think the balance is shifting in ways that are very important for our national security concerns. I think they're also going to come to these core questions of how is research driven in our universities, what's going to drive the educational system as well. So it's the ecosystem. I actually think our ecosystem is healthy, changing in some ways that are alarming, but fundamentally I think we've adapted to change after change, and I'm optimistic we're going to adapt to these changes as well.
And there was a rift with DARPA at one point in the university world, and it seems like that has been healed.
I hope it's healed. I think they've always been an important part of how we get great things done.
Yeah. Thank you for talking to us this evening.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with everybody.
John Hall back on.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, John. That was fun.